The Smoky Mountains have their own kind of silence in winter. Not the emptiness of a room after a door has closed, but the layered quiet of a forest holding its breath. Snow presses into the branches, creeks slide under thin glass, and every sound carries farther than it should. I had moved into a small cabin on the edge of Townsend, Tennessee, only a few weeks earlier, hoping the hush would help me start over. The divorce had left me feeling like someone had stripped all the furniture out of my life, and I thought maybe a little solitude would help me piece it back together. Most mornings I'd wake before the sun, make coffee, and sit by the window with Luna. My black cat, my only companion. She was the kind who didn't make a lot of noise, but always seemed to know what mattered before I did. That morning, like the 2 mornings before it, she froze mid-stretch and pointed her ears toward the sycamore that leaned crookedly across the creek. I had shrugged it off at first. Cats stare at things we don't understand all the time. Dust shadows the invisible world. But this time I listened. At first I thought it was the wind whistling through a knot in the trunk. Then I heard it again. A sound too deliberate to be wind, too fragile to be mistaken for anything mechanical. Thin, high, almost invisible, like a thread pulled tight across the air, a cry. When you live alone long enough, you second-guess yourself. I wondered if it was in my head some echo of the silence I had been carrying since the house emptied. But Luna was locked in place, tail flicking, once eyes fixed. Animals don't hallucinate ghosts of sound. They respond to what is real. It wasn't until the 3rd time I heard it that my stomach dropped. A cry like that doesn't belong to wind or owl or squirrel. It was the voice of something small, young, alive. Out here in January, that could only mean one thing, a bear cub. Now, a black bear cub, born in the Smokies, isn't news in itself. Each winter sows den in hollow logs or tree cavities, giving birth to blind cubs the size of chipmunks. But the cry of a cub heard outside the safety of a den, it's a sound of trouble. A cub calling is a cub alone, cold or separated. And at that age, every minute matters. I stood at the window with my coffee cooling in my hand, heart beating harder than I wanted to admit. I had wanted solitude, but what I heard was not solitude, it was a plea, the kind you don't ignore. If I hadn't been paying attention, I might have missed it altogether. Hollow trees act like mufflers, softening sound. Winter air can carry cries farther at dawn, but the timbre is faint more vibration than volume. Scientists explain it as frequency. Overlap, cubs cry in ranges between 700–900 Hz, right where human hearing starts to blur with ambient wind. But cats like Luna detect higher frequencies with ease. She had been hearing it all along, trying to tell me with her body. Sometimes the only reason we notice what matters is that another creature insists on showing us. I set the cup down and walked outside, crunching across the frosted deck. The cold wrapped my face and hands instantly. The creek whispered below, brittle at the edges, and the oak tree stood dark against the pale sky. Nothing moved. I waited, listening. The minutes stretched, and then so faint I almost doubted myself a second cry. I couldn't see the cub, of course. They stayed tucked deep inside hollows curled against their mother's warmth. But if the mother wasn't there, if she had been spooked or injured, the cub would keep calling until exhaustion silenced it. That silence more than the cry is what kills. I felt an ache in my chest that had nothing to do with the cold. I thought about how many cries I had ignored in my own life. The ignored phone calls during the last months of my marriage. The emails from family. I never answered the quiet pleas I hadn't been willing to hear. Now here I was, in a hollow cabin beside a hollow tree, face to face with a cry I couldn't deny. I pulled out my phone. In towns that edge the Smokies, people know better than to rush a wild animal rescue on their own. There are rules for good reason. Sows may return, and a human stepping in too early can cause more harm than good. But there are also moments when doing nothing is fatal. So the protocol is simple. Listen, document, and call Wildlife Services. That morning, I did just that. My voice trembled a little when I told the dispatcher what I'd heard. She asked questions. Did I see the mother? How long had the sound been consistent? Could I describe the tree? I gave her my answers as best I could. She told me an officer named Caleb was on his way. While I waited, I stood at the edge of the creek, Luna pressed against the window behind me, both of us staring at the tree. I remember feeling an odd mix of dread and hope, the same way I felt in court when the judge asked if I was ready to sign the final papers. That same sense of what happens next will change everything. And that's really what mornings in the Smokies teach you. If you let them change, rarely arrives in thunder. More often, it's in the faintest sound carried on the air, a sound that asks if you're paying attention. I thought of an example the ranger later told me. 2 years earlier, a hiker had paused on a ridge because his dog had stopped ears forward. The hiker listened, heard a distant whimper, and called it in. That sound turned out to be another cub lodged between boulders after sliding from a den. Because he didn't write it off his imagination, that cub was saved. Fresh perspective often comes from realizing that nature doesn't shout. It whispers. The forest is full of small voices, each one with consequences if ignored. In a time when everything in our lives is loud notifications, headlines, the churn of daily noise, paying attention to a cry as thin as a thread can feel like stepping into another world. But maybe it's the world we need more. By the time Caleb's truck pulled into the gravel drive, I'd already decided something. Whatever was inside that tree, I was committed. I wasn't a rescuer, not yet, not officially. But I had listened. And listening, I was beginning to understand, is the first act of rescue. As Caleb stepped out to thermal camera in hand, he asked me the same question twice. "You sure you heard it?" I nodded. Luna answered for me by leaping back onto the sill ears, forward body tight. Caleb glanced at her, then at me, and smiled. "I believe the cat," he said. That broke the tension for a moment, but as we walked toward the tree together, I realized this was only the beginning. The cry was still in the air, faint, fragile, fading with the wind. Somewhere inside that hollow life was hanging on by threads, waiting for someone to pay attention long enough to answer. And with that, the silence of the Smokies became something else entirely, not emptiness, but expectation. What happened next required patience, expertise, and a clear boundary between wanting to help and knowing how to help. Caleb would show me that line, the place where listening hands over to action. And that's where the story turns in the next part. The call and the code when not to be a hero. When Caleb stepped out of his truck, he moved without hurry. That alone told me something. People in uniforms usually radiate urgency. They come to fix, to act, to take over. But his pace was steady, almost quiet, as if he was joining a rhythm that had already begun. I was jittering with the need to do something, tear at the bark, climb the tree, shove my arm inside if I had to. But Caleb reminded me with his very presence this wasn't my rescue to lead. He carried a thermal camera in one hand, a coiled rope in the other, and slung over his shoulder a canvas satchel that looked heavy enough to belong on a battlefield. He nodded at me, then at Luna in the window. "She's the real scout," he said. "Never ignore a cat that points twice." We crossed the creek and stood before the sycamore. Caleb lifted the camera, pressed the screen to his eye, and adjusted the dial. For a long moment, he didn't speak. I leaned in, heart hammering, trying to see what he saw. At last, he lowered the camera. Heat signature faint, tucked down near the base cavity. Could be a cub. It could be a raccoon. Either way, young alone. I started to step forward, but he raised a hand. "Before we go closer, we wait." That single word, wait, hit me harder than I expected. I thought of all the times in my life I had leapt too fast, rushing into arguments or decisions just because silence felt unbearable. Waiting had never been my strength, but here waiting might mean survival. Caleb explained the code of conduct that governs every wildlife rescue in the Smokies. First, never assume abandonment. Black bear mothers can leave the den for hours to forage, trusting their cubs will remain quiet and safe. Second, never intervene without observation. A cub calling may be distressed, but unless you know for sure the mother is gone, stepping in can fracture the bond permanently. Third, never let human need override animal need. That one stung. My need to act was strong, but it wasn't the cub's need. We stood still for 20 minutes. The only sound was the wind tugging at branches and the occasional creak bubble under ice. My legs stiffened, but Caleb didn't shift once. He was listening the way surgeons listen with stethoscopes, not ears. Finally, the cry came again, thin, high, unmistakable. Caleb nodded, made a note on his pad, and only then allowed us to move closer. He tapped along the bark with his knuckles, listening for hollow pockets. When he found the cavity, he pulled a small bore scope from his satchel, a flexible tube with a camera at the end, and slid it gently into the opening. I held my breath, staring at the monitor clipped to his belt. A flicker of movement, a scrap of fur curled trembling, tiny paws tucked in. My chest tightened. "That's a cub," Caleb said quietly. "No sow in sight, no adult heat signature. We'll call this a probable orphan." He turned to me. "Now comes the hardest part." I expected him to say we'd pull it out. Instead, he said, "We leave it for now." Every nerve in my body screamed against that answer. "But it's crying. It's alone." He shook his head gently. "If the mother returns and finds we've been here, she may reject it. Our presence is already at risk. Best practice is to monitor first. Give her the chance to come back." I wanted to argue. Everything human in me wanted to scoop that cub into my arms and warm it by the stove. But Caleb told me a story that silenced me. A year ago, he'd responded to a similar call. A cub had been mewling near a campground, and by the time he arrived, a well-meaning couple had already lifted it out, wrapped it in a blanket, and driven it 30 miles toward town. By the time he caught up with them, the cub was hypothermic. They'd fed it cow's milk, which bears can't digest. Despite their good intentions, the cub didn't make it. Meanwhile, the sow had returned to an empty den and prowled the campground for days searching. "They thought they were heroes," Caleb said softly. "They didn't know the code. Good hearts, bad outcome." That was my lesson in restraint. Sometimes rescue isn't pulling something out. It's standing guard, holding space, and trusting patience. We stayed another half hour documenting every sound, every absence. Caleb explained how black bears den differently from grizzlies. Here in the Smokies, tree hollows are common dens. Mothers will scrape out bedding from leaves and cedar bark. Cubs born blind in January don't open their eyes until March. They depend entirely on maternal warmth. If that warmth is gone too long, hypothermia sets in fast. But, and this was critical, sometimes the sow is only briefly away. Rushing in can mean the difference between reunion and permanent loss. As the cold deepened and the cry grew fainter, Caleb sighed. "This is borderline. We'll need to act soon, but protocol says we call it in prep equipment and wait for clearance." He radioed dispatch, his voice steady. "Probable orphan. Heat signature is low. Awaiting guidance." I felt powerless, but in that powerlessness, something shifted. I realized that listening, not acting, was still a form of doing. It was honoring the rhythm of the forest, not imposing my own. In human emergencies, speed saves lives. In wild emergencies, patience does. Our instinct to rush to fix, to play savior, often it collides with a system older than us, one that requires stillness. That's the code Caleb lived by. An example helped me anchor it. Caleb told me about a den found 2 winters earlier. Hikers had reported cries, but officers monitored for 3 days before intervening. On the 4th day, the sow returned, dragging herself after a minor injury. She crawled back into the den, curled around her cubs, and all 3 survived. If humans had acted too soon, those cubs would have been raised in captivity, stripped of the wild bond that defines their species. By the time Caleb finished his story, I wasn't restless anymore. I felt the weight of waiting settle into my bones, and it was strangely calming. It reminded me that silence isn't absence, it's potential. The sun had climbed a little higher, casting pale light across the creek. Caleb finally said, "All right, we've given her time. She's not returning. Now we prepare." He coiled his rope, checked his satchel, and gave me a look that was half warning, half invitation. "This part we do carefully, and you'll see why the code exists." I nodded, heart heavy but ready. Luna still watched from the cabin window, tail wrapped tight, gaze locked on us. Somehow I felt she knew what was coming. What followed was not dramatic in the way I'd imagined rescues to be. No rushing, no shouting, no chaos. Just precise steps, deliberate movements, and a constant awareness that one wrong cut could mean collapse. Caleb called it tree medicine, and that's where we'll go next. Tree medicine, the safest way to open a hollow. When Caleb finally decided it was time, he didn't rush. He crouched by the tree-gloved hand resting against the bark as if he were greeting an old patient. "Every tree has a pulse," he murmured. "If we cut carelessly, we kill more than we save." That phrase, tree medicine, was his shorthand. It meant respecting the hollow as much as the cub. You don't just tear it apart because you're desperate to get inside. You move with precision like a surgeon. He unrolled a canvas mat on the ground, laying out tools with quiet ritual. A small rotary saw clamps a wedge and the bore scope again. Nothing looked dramatic, but the way he handled them carried weight. I asked if I could help. He pointed to the mat. "Your job is silence. Stand close, watch everything, touch nothing until I tell you." I nodded. My hands twitched to act, but I forced them into my pockets. Caleb began by tapping along the trunk again, mapping where the wood was thinnest. Each knock gave back a tone, solid, hollow, soft, brittle. He marked the weakest spot with chalk, then slipped the bore scope inside once more to check the distance from the cub. 6 inches, he whispered. "That's margin enough." The saw whirred to life, startling in the quiet. The cub's cry cut off instantly. My chest clenched. Caleb paused, let the silence settle, then continued slowly, keeping the cut no larger than a dinner plate. Sawdust drifted down in soft curls, mixing with frost on the mat. When the slab finally came free, Caleb laid it gently aside as though he'd lifted a bandage. Inside the cavity opened like a dark throat. He aimed the flashlight in. The beam landed on a tiny body, curled tight, trembling. The cub was no larger than a loaf of bread. Its fur was damp from condensation, clumped in patches. Eyes still sealed shut, muzzle pressed to its paw, chest heaving. My breath caught at the sight. So fragile, so utterly unprepared for the world. Caleb reached in with both hands, slow as prayer. The cub flinched weakly but didn't resist. He lifted it into the open air, tucking it against his chest where a heated pouch was strapped beneath his coat. "Warm first," he said, voice firm. "Food later." That order mattered. He explained as he worked newborn mammals, especially black bear cubs, crash fast if you feed before warming. Their systems can't process milk cold. It's like pouring water into frozen pipes, it bursts them. So the first rule of cub rescue is always warmth. He placed the cub into a padded, insulated carrier lined with heat packs. The sound of its cry returned louder now, sharper. It clawed weakly at the towel. I felt tears prick my eyes, relief and heartbreak all at once. Then came the lesson in realism. Caleb pulled out a chart and began noting weight, estimated age, temperature, and behavior. He called dispatch reporting vitals. Male cub, likely 3 weeks hypothermic but responsive. His tone was calm, clinical, but beneath it I sensed reverence. I asked if I could hold the cub. He shook his head gently. "Not yet. Bonding is for later. Right now, survival." That moment taught me something about restraint again. Love sometimes means stepping back, not rushing forward. My hands ached to cradle the little body, but letting professionals do their work was the only way love could actually help. To anchor his point, Caleb told another story. 2 winters before, a cub had been rescued from a hollow log near Cade's Cove. The first responder, new to the team, broke protocol and fed it before warming. The cub aspirated, lungs flooded, and it didn't survive. "He meant well," Caleb said quietly. "But meaning well isn't enough. You need the code, you need the order, the order. Warmth, then nourishment, then rest. Simple, but life or death." We carried the carrier back across the creek, setting it in the truck where a portable incubator waited. Caleb adjusted the temperature, slid the cub inside, and secured the latch. The faint cries grew steadier, almost rhythmic. He exhaled. That's better. He'll make it through transport. As we stood by the truck, he explained more of the science. Black bear cubs are born in January, typically twins, sometimes singles, rarely triplets. They weigh less than a pound at birth. Their survival hinges entirely on their mother's presence, her warmth, her milk, her protection. Without her, even hours can tip the scale. That's why hollow trees matter. They aren't accidents, they're lifelines. The insulation of wood, the shield from predators, and the way condensation keeps humidity stable. A good hollow is as vital as a mother's embrace. To cut one open is never casual. That's why Caleb called it tree medicine. Every incision must heal behind you, leaving the forest intact for the next denning season. He showed me how he sealed the cut after removal, fitting the slab back, securing it with biodegradable mesh and resin. This tree still has years left. We don't take its future for one rescue. We honor both. That perspective floored me. I'd come thinking only of the cub. But here was a man who saw layers: the cub, the mother, the tree, the forest, the cycle. Rescue wasn't just extraction, it was stewardship. As the truck engine rumbled to life, I thought about how often in my own life I'd torn things open to fix them, relationships, jobs, even my own heart, without thinking of how to mend what I left behind. Caleb's method showed me another way. Careful incisions followed by careful repair. That's medicine. On the drive to the rehab center, Caleb outlined the routine ahead. Feeding schedules every 3 to 4 hours, specialized formula, and strict record keeping. Night shifts that meant setting alarms at midnight to 3 a.m. 6 a.m. health scares were constant respiratory infections, dehydration, diarrhea that could spiral in hours. Each cub meant weeks of sleepless vigilance. People think rescue is cuddles, he said with a weary smile. It's really spreadsheets and alarms. But when they open their eyes in March, when they take their first steps, that's when it feels worth every lost night. I imagined those long nights, the kind I already knew too well after the divorce, sitting awake at 3 a.m. with nothing but silence. Only now the silence would be filled with breath and heartbeat and possibility. When we reached the center, the staff moved quickly, transferring the cub into a sterile, warm room. One vet listened with a stethoscope, another prepared the first tiny bottle. Caleb stepped aside, letting them take over. His role was finished for now. Before we left, I asked him the question that had been pressing on me since morning. How do you not break doing this over and over? He considered, then answered with a quiet weight. You don't do it alone. The forest, the staff, the neighbors, even strangers, you lean on them. Rescue isn't a hero story. It's a relay. You carry the life as far as you can, then hand it on. That fresh perspective reframed everything for me. I had walked into this thinking of myself as a witness to one cub. What I was really witnessing was a chain: every listener, every responder, every hand passing life along. No one saves alone. As we drove back toward my cabin, the woods seemed different. Not silent anymore, but humming with unseen threads. Each tree a shelter, each cry a signal, each human a potential link. When I stepped onto my porch, Luna brushed against my leg. Tail high, eyes steady. She looked at me as if to say, "You listened. That's what mattered." I exhaled, finally letting the tension drain. The cub was safe, the tree still stood, the forest remained whole. And I had learned the order: warmth, nourishment, rest, repair. But rescue doesn't end with extraction. It echoes in the community that forms around it, the neighbors who check in, the strangers who bring blankets, the way loneliness bends into connection. That's where this story turns next. Night House, Open Heart, how rescue builds a community. When Caleb drove off with the cub, the cabin felt emptier than ever. The creek outside gurgled as though nothing had happened, yet the silence inside pressed in heavier than before. I brewed tea, sat at the kitchen table, and tried to tell myself that the job was done. But something lingered. A strange tension in the air, like the forest was still watching. That night, Luna refused to leave the window. She perched on the sill, tail wrapped neatly, ears tilting at every whisper beyond the glass. Every so often she would turn her head toward me, blink once, then return her gaze to the dark. It wasn't distrust. It was more like she was saying, "Stay ready." I didn't realize until later that readiness is what community is built on, neighbors tuned to one another, waiting quietly for signs, responding not in panic, but in care. I had come here for solitude, but that night, solitude cracked open. At 7, headlights swept across my drive. It was Henry, the neighbor, who had lived on this road for 40 years. He stepped out carrying a crock pot in both hands. "Figured you'd forget supper," he said. He set it on my counter, plugged it in, and ladled me a bowl of chili before I had time to answer. Then he sat down like he belonged there. We didn't talk about the cub at first. He told me about the church bake sale, about how the old bridge downriver was finally being repaired. Then he leaned back, folded his arms, and said, "You did right calling Caleb. Took me too long to learn that myself." He told me an example from his younger days. He once found a fox kit caught in a wire and rushed it straight home. He didn't know about rehab centers, didn't know about rabies risk. The kit died within hours. "Worst feeling of my life," he said quietly. All because I thought I had to be the hero. Hearing him, I understood that my mourning with Caleb hadn't just saved one cub. It had tied me to a web of stories already strung across this valley. Everyone here carried a memory of trying to help, sometimes failing, sometimes learning, and those memories linked us. The next day, Olivia, the elementary teacher from town, stopped by. She had heard from dispatch that I'd called in the cub. She left a basket of old towels on the porch. "For the next one," she said with a half smile. "There's always a next one." She stayed for tea, asking questions about Luna, about the cabin, about why I'd moved here. I told her the truth, that I had come because silence felt easier than conversations that reminded me of what I'd lost. She nodded. "Silence is fine," she said, "but so is company." That became the small lesson of the week. Rescue is never about one creature. It ripples outward, drawing people together who might otherwise stay on their own islands. The cub was in a rehab center, but here in this town it had already done another kind of work. It had cracked open doors. Over the next days, people stopped by one. A farmer from up the road dropped off a bale of straw in case another animal needed bedding. A retired nurse brought a box of heat packs. Even strangers from the gas station nodded at me like they knew. The story had traveled faster than I could. Somehow I had become the bear cub caller. It startled me at first. I wasn't used to being recognized for anything good. For months after the divorce, I had felt invisible, or worse, noticed only for failing. But now people's eyes softened when they looked at me. They weren't praising me. They were thanking me for listening. That subtle difference mattered. The fresh perspective settled on me slowly. Maybe community isn't built through grand gestures, but through these small exchanges of readiness, listening, sharing a meal, leaving a towel on a porch. The cub had drawn us into each other's orbit, and the gravity held. One night, Henry came over again. This time, he brought a notebook. Inside were sketches of the hollow trees he'd mapped through his years hiking. "Every one of these could be a den," he explained. "Figured you ought to know which ones to keep an ear on." We sat at the table marking stars on the map, Luna batting at the corner of the paper. It felt less like planning for disaster and more like weaving a net. Of course, it wasn't just heartwarming. There were costs. My phone buzzed with updates from the rehab center, each one reminding me of sleepless volunteers pulling night shifts, buying formula that cost more than most groceries, worrying over every ounce gained or lost. I donated what I could, but it wasn't much. Still, even that act, writing a small check, felt like belonging to something larger. It reminded me of a phrase Caleb had used: "Rescue is a relay. You carry life as far as you can, then pass it on." That week I realized the relay baton doesn't just pass between professionals. It passes between neighbors too. Every time someone left a blanket or a pot of food, they were running their stretch of the relay. Here's an example that sealed it for me. Olivia's class made cards for the rehab staff. Crayon drawings of cubs in trees, notes that said, "Thank you for saving him." When Caleb delivered the stack, he told me later the room went quiet. Volunteers who had been awake for 3 nights straight smiled through tears. That's community. To encouragement as nourishment, so the lesson was clear. When one life trembles, it calls forth many. And if we listen, we don't just save the trembling one, we save ourselves from loneliness, from disconnection, from forgetting we belong to each other. The mystery lingered, though. Each night, Luna still perched at the window, watching the tree line as though listening for something I could not hear. Her stillness made me wonder if the cub we had rescued was only the first. Maybe the forest had more voices waiting. Maybe the relay wasn't done. That thought both unsettled and comforted me. Unsettled because I knew how fragile life out here could be. Comforted because I no longer felt alone in facing it. I had Henry with his maps, Olivia with her tea neighbors, with their gifts, even the school children with their crayons. And always I had Luna the sentinel who heard first. The cabin didn't feel empty anymore. It felt alive, like the walls had widened to include everyone who had stepped through the door that week. Even the silence felt different, not heavy, but full of breath. Yet readiness is not enough. You can listen, you can gather towels, you can share meals. But if the source of the cries keeps repeating, if the same hollow or crawl space draws the vulnerable again and again, you must face the deeper mystery. Why here? That's the question that arrived next as Luna's ears turned not to the tree, but to the porch. And that's where the story moves. The colony mystery, one door, many litters. It was barely a week after the cub rescue when Luna shifted her focus. No longer the sycamore across the creek. This time her ears swiveled toward the porch. At first I thought she was chasing shadows, but then I heard it faint mews, almost like the cub's cries, but sharper, closer, more insistent. I grabbed a flashlight, stepped outside, and followed the sound to the lattice under the porch. When the beam caught the gap, 2 tiny eyes blinked back. Then another pair. Then another. Kittens. I crouched low, breath fogging in the cold air, and realized the mystery was larger than one hollow tree. The same doorway, the same space was being used again and again, this time not by a bear, but by a feral cat colony. One queen, maybe more, had been slipping beneath the porch to birth her litters. I called Dr. Grace, the local veterinarian, who came by the next day with traps and patients. She explained the cycle. One unspayed female can produce 3 litters in a year, 4 to 6 kittens each. Multiply that by 2 years, and suddenly dozens of kittens pour from the same hidden entry points. It's not neglect, she said. It's instinct. They return to what feels safe, even if it isn't safe at all. The kittens we caught were scrappy, underweight, and crawling with fleas. One had an upper respiratory infection so bad that it could barely open its eyes. We bundled them in towels, warmed them on heating pads, and fed them with tiny bottles every 4 hours, midnight. 4 a.m., dawn, noon, evening. The schedule reminded me of Caleb's words about cubs. Warmth first, food, second rest, third. Rescue had an order, whether for wild bears or half-feral kittens. The realism of it hit hard. Nights broken by alarms, the smell of formula clinging to the kitchen, the exhaustion of coaxing a sick kitten to swallow one more drop. Some mornings I doubted I had the strength, but then one of them would blink at me with new clarity or stumble toward the litter box for the first time, and I knew the effort mattered. Henry came by to help seal the lattice, shaking his head. "One door, many litters," he muttered. "If you don't fix the door, you'll be fixing kittens forever." He was right. The small lesson was clear: rescue doesn't end at saving. It requires prevention. Dr. Grace introduced me to the TNR program, Trap Neuter Return. Volunteers set humane traps, spay, or neuter the adults, then release them back. It breaks the cycle while allowing the colony to live out its life without multiplying. She told me about a case in a nearby town where one colony had exploded to more than 50 cats before intervention. With TNR, the numbers stabilized, kittens stopped appearing in crawl spaces, and the remaining adults lived healthier, calmer lives. Hearing that gave me a fresh perspective. Sometimes the most compassionate act isn't rescue in the moment, but breaking the chain that creates the need for rescue. Compassion can be quiet surgical preventative like Caleb's tree medicine, but for cycles of life gone unchecked. One example drove it home. Among the kittens was a little gray female we called Muffin. She was the runt too weak to nurse from the bottle, so we fed her drop by drop with a syringe. For days we didn't know if she'd make it, but she rallied, gained weight, and purred so loud her whole body vibrated. Weeks later, when she was adopted by a retired couple, I felt both joy and ache. Letting go was harder than I imagined, yet that goodbye mattered because it meant space opened for the next rescue. Financially, it wasn't easy. Formula, vet visits, litter, medications, it added up fast. I drained savings I had intended for cabin repairs, but each receipt felt like a ledger of belonging. I wasn't just fixing kittens. I was repairing the silence that had ruled my life for too long. What struck me most was how quickly the community rallied. Olivia's class donated cans of kitten food. The farmer left old towels by the porch. Even strangers on the neighborhood board offered rides to vet appointments. Somehow my cabin, once a place of solitude, had become a hub. I was no longer the man alone in the woods. I was becoming the cat guy. It surprised me how healing that label felt. For so long, I'd been defined by lost, divorced, alone. Starting over. Now people recognize me for listening, for acting with care. And in their eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: trust. The kittens thrived, though not all. One slipped away in the night, too weak despite every effort. I buried it beneath the sycamore, the same tree where we'd heard the bear cub. The circle of sound and silence tightened, reminding me again that not every cry is answered with survival. Still, every answered cry matters. That evening, as Luna perched on the windowsill watching the sealed lattice, I thought about the bigger picture. The bear cub, the kittens, the neighbors, the vet, all tied to the same truth spaces we ignore become the places life slips into unseen, repeating itself. The hollow tree, the porch lattice, the gaps in our listening hearts. If we don't seal the entry points, we'll be rescuing forever. And maybe that isn't bad. Maybe rescue isn't a one-time act, but a way of living, listening, responding, preventing, repairing. Yet even as the kittens settled, I noticed Luna's ears turning again, this time not toward the porch, but back to the tree line. She froze at dusk, staring into the woods as if waiting for another faint voice. That watchfulness planted a question in me. Why do some animals cry out while others stay silent? The answer came slowly, in the science of listening, and that's where the story moves. Science of listening, why Luna is right, and why the woods go quiet. Luna froze again at the window one evening, ears rotating like twin compasses. The porch light hummed, the creek rattled with meltwater, yet she didn't blink. I followed her stare into the timberline, waiting. Nothing stirred. No cry, no rustle, only the kind of silence that presses on your chest. I almost turned away. Then I remembered the cub, the kittens, the way she had been right every time before. It made me wonder, how does a house cat know? Before I do. Why is it that her stillness carries more truth than my ears? That curiosity pulled me down a rabbit hole of science and experience, and what I learned changed not just how I looked at Luna, but how I listened to the Smokies themselves. Here's the first explanation. Cats hear at frequencies up to 64 kHz, nearly double what the human ear detects. That means, where I hear only wind brushing through leaves, Luna hears the subtle squeak of a vole under snow or the faint whimper of a cub in a hollow tree. She's tuned to ranges we've forgotten. Evolution built her to notice what I miss. Second, her body tells the story. When she freezes ears, locked, tail rigid, that's prey mode behavior. Silence becomes a signal, something vulnerable, something hiding. To a cat, quiet doesn't mean absence. It means presence waiting. I saw this once in action. Years earlier, visiting a friend in Colorado, his barn cat suddenly crouched by the wall. We thought nothing of it until a faint scratching proved her right, mice trapped in the feed bin. Her listening saved the grain. Now here in Tennessee, Luna's listening saved lives much larger scale. But it isn't just cats. The woods themselves carry codes if you know how to hear them. Naturalists call it the soundscape. Birds chatter constantly until danger passes through. Then the forest drops silent, a hush more alarming than any call. That sudden quiet is how deer know a coyote is near, how squirrels know to flatten against bark, how the whole web communicates without a word. I remember walking with Caleb later that spring. A chorus of chickadees sang overhead. Suddenly they stopped all at once. The air went still. Caleb raised a hand. Seconds later, a black bear lumbered across the trail 50 yards ahead. "See," he whispered. The woods told us before our eyes could. That example hammered home the small lesson listening isn't passive. It's active attention tuned not just to sound, but to its absence. Humans drown in noise. We assume silence is nothing. In truth, silence is often the loudest warning. It struck me how this paralleled my own life. During the final months of my marriage, the arguments weren't what ended us. It was the silence. Meals eaten without words, evenings with television muttering in the background, but no real presence. I mistook that quiet for peace. In reality, it was the forest that was still before departure. If I had listened better, perhaps I would have noticed sooner. That realization opened a fresh perspective. Maybe Luna wasn't just showing me how to hear animals. Maybe she was teaching me how to hear people and myself, too. Science gives us tools. Biologists record spectrograms, visual maps of sound-revealing layers beyond our ears. High-pitched bat calls, ultrasonic rodent squeaks, even the ultrasonic cries of stressed kittens, all invisible to humans without instruments. Yet animals like Luna translate these for us if we're willing to trust their signals. I thought of the bear cub again. Its cry sat right on the edge of human hearing, easy to dismiss as wind. But Luna froze, and that freeze was data. Without her, I might never have believed my own ears. In that sense, she became the bridge between worlds. It made me rethink the cabin itself. Old houses creak and hum their own soundscapes. The ticking clock, the wind against the siding, the drip of a faucet. Before, those noises annoyed me. Now I wondered, what if every sound, every silence carried meaning? What if the house was speaking too, reminding me of what needed care? Fix the faucet. Mend the shutter. Pay attention. That attitude shifted my routines. I began setting aside 5 minutes each dawn to simply sit and listen. No phone, no distraction, just me, Luna, and the woods. At first it felt pointless, but then patterns emerged. Crows first, then chickadees, then squirrels. When those patterns broke, I noticed. And in noticing, I felt woven into the place in a way solitude never gave me. An example came one misty morning. The crows never called. The usual racket at the ridge was absent. I waited uneasy. Hours later, a storm front rolled in earlier than forecasted. The birds had known long before radar did. That morning convinced me that listening is as much a survival skill as sight. The lesson deepened silence isn't emptiness. It's information. To ignore it is to miss the warnings and the wonders both. This perspective stretched beyond nature. I realized that when neighbors stopped by with towels or chili, the gift wasn't just the object. It was the act of listening. Listening to my quiet house, sensing my solitude and stepping in. They heard what I didn't say. That's how community works. Attunement to silences, filling them gently. Financially, emotionally, even spiritually, the cost of listening is small, the payoff is vast. You catch the faint mew before it dies out. You catch the quiet of a friend before loneliness hardens. You catch the shift in a forest before danger arrives. Listening saves. I wondered too about the animals who stay silent. For every cub or kitten that cries, how many go unheard, hidden forever? That mystery sits heavy. But maybe that's why the forest gifts us creatures like Luna to be our translators, our alarm bells, our reminders that paying attention is not wasted. That night, as she perched by the sill again, I whispered thanks. She flicked her tail once, still fixed on the dark, as if saying, "You're learning." Keep listening, but listening alone cannot shield you from the hardest part. When the cries turn into healthy lives, when kittens grow strong or cubs are ready for release, you face the moment of goodbye. And that farewell, painful, necessary, teaches its own kind of medicine. That's where the story moves. Returns and goodbyes, what it costs and why it's worth it. When the call came that the cub was ready for release, I felt both relief and ache. Months had passed since that frozen morning when Luna first pointed to the hollow tree. Now the cub, once no heavier than a loaf of bread, had grown strong enough to climb, wrestle, and forage. Caleb invited me to witness the release. I thought I was prepared. We drove to a corridor deep in the Smokies, a stretch of forest protected from traffic and campsites. Volunteers carried the crate to the clearing, opened the latch, and stepped back. The cub hesitated at first, blinking at the light, then bolted into the undergrowth without looking back. Gone in seconds. Everyone clapped softly, but I stood still, throat tight. I had imagined some farewell, a pause, a glance. Instead, there was only absence, the kind of absence that feels like both loss and victory at once. Caleb must have seen my face because he said, "That's what you want." No thanks, no hesitation. Wild where he belongs. Driving home, I turned the lesson over in my mind. Rescue aims for release, not attachment. The measure of success is not how much the creature bonds to you, but how ready it is to leave you. It felt backward to my heart, but forward to its life. That same month, 2 of the kittens under my porch, Muffin and Onyx, found their families. Muffin, the gray runt we had once fed with a syringe, went to a retired couple who had lost their dog the year before. They sent me a photo. A week later, Muffin sprawled across the husband's lap, both of them asleep. Onyx, sleek and bold, went to a family with 2 children. The kids renamed him Shadow and sent videos of him chasing soccer balls across the living room. Each adoption day, I lingered too long, reluctant to hand over the carrier. I drove home with empty towels and the hollow ache of goodbye. The cabin felt larger and smaller all at once. Luna sat by the door, blinking slowly, reminding me without words, "This is the point. You carried them far enough for someone else to take the baton." The cost of those weeks weighed on me. Formula vaccinations, flea treatments, litter, endless laundry. The receipts piled up faster than I had expected. I had postponed cabin repairs, patched leaks with tape, and chosen kibble over nicer groceries. Financial strain pressed at the edges of my resolve. And the emotional toll nights, broken by alarms, the heartbreak of losing one kitten, despite everything, the weight of deciding who was strong enough to leave. Sometimes it threatened to undo me. Yet when I traced those costs against the lives now safe, the balance sheet changed. The cub running free, the kittens curled in warm homes, the neighbors closer, my own heart less silent. The return outweighed the expense. The cost became proof of belonging. One evening, Henry put it simply. We were sitting on the porch, mugs of coffee in hand, listening to the chorus of frogs by the creek. "Every good thing costs something," he said. "The trick is knowing which costs make you poorer and which make you richer. This one, it's the richest I've seen you since you moved here." That stayed with me. I realized the mystery wasn't just why animals kept finding my cabin, it was why helping them kept finding me. The fixer-upper I had bought to escape people had become a sanctuary, not just for wildlife, but for neighbors too. The patched lattice, the sealed vent, the blankets stacked by the door. Each repair turned the house from shelter into a symbol. What once echoed with absence now hummed with presence. The small lesson was this: letting go doesn't empty you. It makes room for the next arrival. Release is not the end of rescue. It is the opening of space for the cycle to continue. I carried that thought into daily life. When I called my sister in Wisconsin for the first time in months, I realized I was practicing the same thing. Letting go of old silence, opening room for new words. Rescue of the family in its way. When Olivia brought over a loaf of bread and we laughed in the kitchen, I felt it again, release the old loneliness. Welcome the new bond. The fresh perspective became clear. Every goodbye carries 2 sides. Pain for what leaves and possibility for what arrives. If you hold only the pain, you miss the arrival. If you embrace the possibility, the pain becomes part of the proof that you lived connected. The forest mirrored this truth. Trees drop leaves in fall, not as a loss, but as preparation for spring. Streams shed ice not as death, but as a return to flow. A cub runs into the undergrowth without looking back, and that is health, not rejection. The cabin echoed the forest now. Each patched door, each empty towel, each farewell. They were part of the cycle, not breaks in it. I thought again of Caleb's words. Rescue is a relay. Each release is the handoff proof that the baton keeps moving. And maybe that's the real worth, not in keeping, but in knowing you were one link in a chain larger than yourself. The cabin at night reflected that shift. Where once the silence pressed heavily, now it carried warmth. Luna, still perched by the window ears, forward, eyes bright sentinel to the unseen. I trusted her more than ever. When she stared too long into the dark, I didn't feel fear. I felt readiness. Because readiness matters. It's what keeps you alert for the smallest sound, the faintest cry, the quietest shift in the air. And sometimes those whispers aren't just about animals. They're about the voice inside yourself you've been ignoring. That's where this story ends, the smallest voice payoff and call to action. The cabin is never silent now. Not because of noise, but because of presence. Footsteps on old boards, the soft thud of paws landing from the windowsill, the creak of Henry's chair when he drops by the hum of Olivia's laughter over tea. Even the stillness hums differently. And yet, I keep returning to one thought. All of this began with a voice so faint I almost ignored it. The bear cub in the hollow tree. The kittens under the porch, the neighbors who rallied, the friendships that formed each was a ripple from a single cry. A cry so thin it could have vanished into the wind. That is the mystery. I cannot shake how much of life is decided not by the shouts we hear, but by the whispers we choose to answer. Science offers one explanation. In nature, survival often depends on faint signals. A rustle in leaves warns prey of predators. A single alarm note from a bird alerts the whole canopy. For black bear cubs, a cry no louder than a squeak of wind can determine whether a mother returns or an orphan is found. These signals are quiet because loudness invites danger. The smallest voice is often the bravest. But there's another layer, one not measured on spectrograms. Small voices live in us too. The tug to call an old friend, the urge to check on a neighbor, the instinct to pause at the sound we'd rather dismiss. How many of those voices have I ignored in my own life? Too many. Silence in my marriage, silence in my family, silence in myself. I learned too late that ignoring faint signals leads to collapse just as surely as ignoring cries in the woods. An example, months after the cub's release, I visited the rehab center again. A new volunteer told me about a litter that hadn't survived because no one called in the cries soon enough. She didn't say it bitterly, only with quiet sadness. Sometimes people think they're imagining it, she explained. By the time we know it's too late. The lesson was sharp. Delay is its own danger. Listening isn't enough. You must act in time. Knowledge isn't just facts about decibels or denning habits. It's knowing how to translate listening into care. Warmth, first, food, second, rest, third. Seal the entry points, spray the queens, and prevent the next emergency. Call the right number, share the load, keep the chain moving. Rescue is not magic. It's a practice. And like any practice, it grows stronger when more people join. Emotion comes in waves. I remember holding Muffin's empty towel after she was adopted, the ache of loss colliding with pride. I remember Caleb's voice saying, "No thanks, no hesitation," as the cub ran into the woods. I remember Luna's stillness, her ears teaching me to notice what my heart had forgotten. Each moment pulled me further from the loneliness I had wrapped around myself like armor. Each moment proved that answering faint voices saves not just the rescued, but the rescuer too. The fresh perspective is this: the world is loud, but meaning is quiet. The things that change us rarely arrive with fireworks. They arrive as whispers. A cry in a hollow tree, a kitten's mew under a porch. The pause before a neighbor knocks the question you've been avoiding inside yourself. Paying attention to those whispers is how we rediscover connection. So here is the call I leave with you. Take one quiet moment tomorrow. Step onto your porch, or sit by your window, or simply close your eyes in your room. Listen, not for shouts, not for headlines, but for what hums underneath the rustle, the stillness, the tug in your own chest. Ask yourself what small voice is waiting for me to hear it. Is it an animal, a person, or a piece of myself I've ignored? Because sometimes the faintest sound is the one that saves us. And sometimes rescue begins not when we rush to act, but when we pause long enough to listen. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of the value of listening or of the lives hidden behind silence, carry it forward. Share it with someone. Let it guide you the next time you hear a cry you're tempted to dismiss. And if you'd like to walk with me through more stories like this of bears, kittens, forests, and the quiet ties that bind us, please like this video and subscribe. Your presence here turns this channel into a community, and together we can keep learning to answer the smallest voices before they fade.